the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all. I do have a few announcements. Saturday, May 27th, that is this Saturday, we have our annual Memorial Day service at Rural Cemetery in Bedford. The ceremony will begin at 9 a.m. So that is in the Civil War section of Rural Cemetery. When you pull in, you'll find it, big flagpole, cannons on either side. Usually it lasts anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes. It usually is a very meaningful commemoration, so we hope that you all join us for that. This Saturday at 9 a.m. Coffee and donuts will be available after the ceremony is concluded. We have our summer picnic coming up next month, June 27th at 6 p.m. here at the Low Tide Yacht Club. The cost is $20 per person, and we ask, as always, that if you are willing and able to bring a ship, please do. If you could email Bob, I think, Bob Lytle, if you are coming, if you plan on coming, to just RSVP to Bob Lytle. Our annual election of officers will be up at that meeting. If you are interested in a board position, I know someone out there probably is, especially the presidency of this roundtable. Please reach out to the current president of the roundtable if you're interested in filling any positions. Just let me know. Basically, the process is the board sits down, and then we come out with that final slate that we vote on at our annual meetings. The last few years, there have been no contested positions. If someone wants to run for president, I can assure you it will not be a contested. But let me know if you are interested in a position. This is very exciting. I always enjoy this time of year when we talk about the Joseph Langlois Book Award. The Book Award Committee has selected 2 recipients this year, a first place and a second place award winner. There were 20 applicants from area schools. The first place winner is Owen Gallagher of Apponequet High School. Plans on attending UMass Amherst in the fall, so he gets $500 as the first place winner. The second place winner was Julia Downing of Bishop Stang, so that's a $250 book award to her. So $500 and $250 first and second place. A special thank you to Jack Richer and Peter Rio, our book award committee members. Each year they sit down, usually a dozen plus applicants, go through all of those applications, put in hours of work to do that, so a special thank you to them. I think of all the things that we do as an organization, certainly our Memorial Day service and the book award are 2 of the most meaningful and impactful things that we do for our community. So thank you, especially to Peter and Jack for all your work on that. I did not plan on this as an announcement, but we have a happy circumstance that a longtime member, a founding member of this roundtable, is present tonight. He's up here from Pennsylvania. We have Bob McFarland here in the audience. Bob brought presents too, so.
Yes, I did. I've been collecting Civil War magazines, as some of you probably have, and True West magazines. So I have a bunch left over, and so I brought a pile of them here, put them on the chairs, and some of you might even have 2 of them on there, which is just fine. And if you see a few extras that aren't just sitting there, take them away with you. But I have, along with Bruce, it was great to see Bruce here because he and I kind of concocted this Civil War Roundtable 15 or 20 years ago, and now I live in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Some of you know I'm down there, but most of you may not. It's important to have an outpost of the New Bedford Civil War Roundtable near Gettysburg and near the Mason-Dixon line to make sure that there is no Confederates that kind of wander across the border looking for, so, and I still present General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Just the other day, I was at the middle school of our town where all the 6th graders came marching through the gym where a number of us had tables set up for a variety of things. So I was the Gettysburg person and in my uniform, my general's uniform. And so I helped 6th graders to learn why was the Civil War fought. Some of them knew there was something to do with slavery, but not everybody did. And Chambersburg is a pretty diverse place, so there might have been 6 or 7 kids around my table every half hour for 6 hours, and half of them might have been white, and half of them might have been black or brown. And so it was a very interesting way of engaging young people, little kids, 6th graders, about the why did we fight the Civil War. And so that people could be equal and that there would not be slavery. Anyways, it's great to be back, and I get your newsletter every month from Bobby Glidel. I talk with this guy once in a while to see how things are going, and it's really fun to be back. Thank you.
Great to have you. So, tonight's presentation, we are joined by Patrick Donovan of the Varnum Memorial Armory Museum in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. Patrick Donovan will explain recent efforts to restore the historic armory, professionalize the care of the museum collections, and add professional conservation services to the Varnum Continentals, a historic nonprofit organization. It helps when I can read my own handwriting. He has with him some really awesome images and things specifically related to the Civil War and the relic acquisitions that have happened in regard to the Civil War, and will share with us those amazing stories. Patrick is the Vice President of the Varnum Continentals, Inc., an all-volunteer non-profit organization that owns and manages 2 museum properties, the James Mitchell Varnum Estate and the Varnum Memorial Armory Museum. As Armory Vice President, Patrick is responsible for the museum, which houses the largest collection of Rhode Island military history on display. The Varnum Continentals' mission since 1907 has been to preserve and share Rhode Island military history with the ultimate aim to educate and encourage patriotism and service of all kinds in the state of Rhode Island and in the country. So it's my privilege to welcome Patrick here this evening.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's taken a while. Some of you have been after me for a while to come out here and visit. I apologize that it's taken as long as it has. I'm always excited to share the wonder and the treasures that are contained in our little museum in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. This is a picture of the front of the building. The building was built between 1913 and 1914. It was, according to newspaper accounts, it was financed and even physically built largely by the members of the organization. And the name of that organization is the Varnum Continentals. And we take our name from James Mitchell Varnum, who was a resident in East Greenwich. He was one of the founders of the Kentish Guard Militia in 1774, along with who would become General Nathaniel Greene. He was a lawyer. He was a 2-term member of the Continental Congress. He would become a brigade commander in George Washington's Continental Line Army. Later in the Revolutionary War, he'd return to Rhode Island, and he would become, he'd be commissioned a major general in command of all of Rhode Island's militia forces. And I'm always amazed he did all of this stuff before the age of 40, which now that I've turned 50 makes me feel like a slacker. Sadly, he passed away of disease as a judge in the Northwest Territory at the age of 40. But as stated, it's been our mission since 1907 to preserve and share Rhode Island military history, ultimately to encourage patriotism, to give people a sense of an appreciation for the founding of our country, the principles upon which our country is founded. That's what we celebrate at the Varnums. This is a picture, this is our very first parade. So we actually started as a museum in the Providence Journal newspaper article that talks about the opening of the Varnum Armory. It specifically mentioned that we had a small room dedicated to the display of war relics. But ostensibly we were a state-chartered militia, ceremonial militia. And of course, when I do tours today, particularly to young people, they hear the word militia and they're immediately kind of a negative reaction. Sadly, militia makes people think of anti-government, right-wing type militias. And of course, that's not what we're about at all. We celebrate the tradition of New England militia, citizen soldiers. New England in particular has a very strong militia tradition, and so we kind of celebrate that history in our museum today. But this picture was taken 115 years ago, almost to the day. It's Memorial Day, Main Street, East Greenwich. Picture of the outside of the Armory. Takes on that kind of look of a medieval castle. On the exterior of the building, we just recently repointed all of the brick, redid the wood trim, the soffits along the top. The roof is going to be our next biggest obstacle as a group. By the way, we're an all-volunteer nonprofit. We've always been all volunteer, and I take a lot of pride in that, and that we're able to do all of this good work. Now, when the current kind of board, the current leadership of the organization came in about 10 years ago, sadly the place was in a real, very poor state. The museum was literally rotting away. And this can happen very, very quickly. This picture was taken circa 2010. I came in early 2014. And these are Civil War uniforms. We have a 1st Rhode Island Cavalry uniform identified with a gentleman from North Kingstown, Lyman Aylesworth. In the center we have a Civil War artillery officer's frock coat. His sash was worn by Captain James Chase of Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. We have a Confederate General Francis Cockrell's veteran coat that he wore in the post-year wars. He served under Pemberton at Vicksburg, was largely out west. But you can see the lack of professionalism and the care of the stuff. Things look clean though. Within just a couple of years, we had an epic flood. I don't know if you remember this, in 2010 was it, or 11? I forget the exact year, but epic flood. And basically half the Armory flooded. And it didn't really, by the time I got in there, everything was covered in mold. All of the wood surfaces. Our museum is, a lot of it's below grade, which is not an ideal situation. No climate control. So there was moths literally eating all of the textiles. That's a bearskin shako hat or cap from circa 1850, belonged to the 1st Light Infantry of Providence, Rhode Island. We have their entire uniform, but you can see what the moths did to that bearskin hat. We have a campaign hat from the 1890s. You can see the mold on there. So it was really a mess when we first came in. This is our founder's militia coat, Howard Vernon Allen. You can see the horrendous moth damage. The bottom of display cases when we removed items. So the very first thing we did is put climate control in the basement, in the museum level I should say, and keep the temperature and humidity at the proper level. We bought a freezer. All of our textiles went through a freezer to make sure all the bugs were dead. Anytime, we have as a best practice, anytime a textile comes into the building, no matter how clean it looks, it immediately goes to the freezer, sits in there for 3 days, we take it out for a day, put it back in the freezer for another 3 days. It's a pain in the rear, but it really makes sure that you don't get an infestation, because that problem can rear its head quickly again. Bottom line is, over the last 10 years or so, we've spent thousands of hours renovating the building, cleaning the building, triaging the museum collection. So our focus in the museum world is Rhode Island military history specifically. And our collection goes from the 17th century all the way through to the present day. The bulk of the collection, as you might imagine, right, we built this place in 1913, 1914. So a lot of our collection is late 1800s, the American Civil War through World War I. That's like most of our material is that. You can see in this lower picture that before and after of these shoulder epaulets. It's 1st Light Infantry of Providence. We go through cans and cans of what's called Renaissance wax. It's a microcrystalline wax that larger museums use to, you clean with that material. You can do that on leather, wood, metal, and it basically provides a seal from the outside environment and helps protect it from corroding. But the real change started to happen with this young lady. This is Maria Vasquez. She is a textile conservator. She has a master's degree in textile conservation from the University of Rhode Island. Because of her volunteer work at the Armory, she is now the collections manager at the Newport Naval War College Museum. I need to update my bio that was read earlier, but I'm now the president of the organization. Maria is now the vice president, and she's the curator of the museum and also does our textile conservation. And basically the two of us have worked very hard to try to professionalize the care of this museum collection as best as we can, you know, given the resources that we have. As I go through this, I'm going to stop and tell some interesting Civil War stories. So she's posing with an absolutely beautiful artillery musician's coat, a shell jacket. It's non-regulation. It was custom made in Providence, Rhode Island, and it was worn by the guy in the picture that she's standing next to. His name was William Lewis. He's actually wearing that very coat in that picture. He enlists at the age of 16 with his mother's permission. The Civil War breaks out. He has 4 siblings. His father was a known, he had mental issues, he was a liar. He abandons the family in the middle of the night. And so William enlists basically to support his family. And he would send, according to all accounts, he sent all of his money home to his family to take care of them. A lot of his letters exist today. He joked about the red piping on his jacket. He said the red piping would draw the girls right to him. He seemed like a good guy that you wanted to have a beer with. Tragically, he was killed at the Battle of Cedar Creek. He took that photograph in Providence in, I think it was May of 1864, and Cedar Creek was October of 1864. And according to their history, according to letters written by his buddies, Battery G, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery, were basically having breakfast, and they were getting ready to move out from their position in the morning. And they were suddenly attacked by A.P. Hill's Corps, and it became a complete melee. They had just hitched their horses to their guns, and the Confederates, some Confederates at one point grab one of those, they get the team of horses in one of the guns and are pulling it away. And according to letters that still exist today, William jumps on his horse, goes at a gallop, gets up alongside the team of horses that are pulling his gun away. He leaps from his horse on top of the team of horses. He gets them to slow down enough where other men in his unit catch up to him, and they basically fight hand to hand, and they recapture their gun. And sadly, it's right at that moment, just after the recapturing of the gun, that he is shot through the chest. And he would linger for 2 days, and we have a transcript of the letter that his buddy wrote home to his mother talking about how he had died. We have a lot of synchronistic things that happen to us in the museum. These objects that seem to mysteriously find their way back to Rhode Island. This is a case in point. Before I had either the coat or the picture, I have a friend who reached out to me on Facebook, and he said, hey, there's a dealer in Massachusetts, and he's got this albumin photograph of William Lewis, a bugler, and Battery G. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. I didn't know anything about his story. I see the picture, and I'm like, that's a fantastic image. I bought it out of my own pocket just to put it in the museum. It was literally like 3 months later, another friend pings me, he's on a trip, and he's like, hey, I'm at a museum in Petersburg, Virginia, and they have a bugler's musician coat from Battery G. I'm like, what? And I'm like, is it identified? And he goes, yeah, William Lewis. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. What are the odds, right? And long story short, I made contact with the director of that museum, and graciously they've allowed us to display the coat, hopefully for the long term. We've had it about 3 years now. So I thought that was pretty cool. So not only do we do textile conservation, but we also do document conservation. And the woman, this is in the middle of COVID, obviously. That's Judy Jungles. She works for Harvard University. Thankfully lives in Providence, but she's a professional document conservationist. And so she does things for us. She does jobs on the side for paying clients, etc. And she happens to be in this picture working on one of my greatest discoveries I've ever found in the museum. So we have many storage rooms, things packed away in boxes that haven't seen the light of day in years and years. And I've had the great pleasure of going through those boxes over the last 10 years. And I always say, I hope I never get to the last box, right? And this is 3 years ago now. I'm thinking in my head, I've already been through everything, I've seen everything, there's nothing else to be discovered. Well, it turns out there was a set of boxes that were filled with junk, random receipts and papers from like the 50s and 60s, and it belonged to one of our founding members who passed away in the 1970s, and the family took all of his junk and basically gave it to us. And apparently I was the first person to go through those boxes, and I'm in the mess hall. It's like Saturday morning, I've got like a garbage bag open at my feet, and I'm just going through stuff, and I'm getting tired, and I just want to go home and eat lunch. And I'm like, there's nothing in this box. And for whatever reason, I stuck my hand in there one last time, and I grabbed a fistful of paper, and I immediately felt that 18th century paper feel. If you've ever felt, it's like a wallpaper, almost like a feeling. I pull it out, it's a letter. I immediately see the date. It's a Revolutionary wartime date. Turns out this is a letter authored by a black soldier in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment of 1778. Rhode Island was the first colony to pass legislation that gave slaves their freedom in exchange for their service. And it was not a popular law, didn't last very long, and only about 90 enslaved people are able to take advantage of that. But this one soldier, Thomas Nichols, who wrote this letter, is one of them. He's writing the letter to his former owner, begging for help to get a discharge because he wants to go home. And the killer quote in there, he says, I want to go home because, quote, war is disagreeable to my mind as well as destructive to my health. I think he has PTSD. He talks about having fits and not being able to go on. He was wounded the year before at the Battle of Rhode Island. He was shot by a Hessian soldier, survives his wound. So maybe it was neurological damage that he's referring to. But he's like, I have no clothes fit to wear. I don't have any money. I don't know anybody. I just want to go home. Very sad letter. But it's one of only 2 letters in existence authored by a black soldier in the Revolutionary War, and I almost threw it out. This is going to go on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir. We've developed a really close relationship with them. They're going to build a life-size figure of that soldier. This is a painting done by the artist Don Troiani. And then they're going to allow us, they're going to have it for 2 years. And then we're actually going to get the letter back and that soldier. They're going to let us have the full life-size figure, which should be pretty cool. All right, and then you see kind of the results of our work. Again, doing our best with the resources we have to try to professionalize how we display these objects and care for them. That's a painting by the African-American artist Edward Bannister. He was the founder of the Providence Art Club. He rarely did portraits. This is an East Greenwich Civil War officer, Charles Tillinghast. He was in the 4th Rhode Island Infantry. He was at the Battle of New Bern, Battle of Antietam. The sword below is a presentation sword for Captain James Allen of the 12th Rhode Island Volunteers. He carried that very sword on the charge in Marie's Heights. December 13th, 1862. The guidon flag that you see there on the right is a Troop L, 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, hard-fighting unit attached to the Army of the Potomac. They formed in the fall of 1861. They go all the way through to Lee's surrender. However, at the Battle of Middleburg, June 17th and 18th, 1863, part of the Gettysburg Campaign, 285 of these 1st Rhode Island cavalrymen ride into Middleburg at a full gallop, and they almost capture Confederate Cavalry General Jeb Stuart. He was by himself with a few staff officers. They chase him out. They're ordered to spend the night in the town. They barricade themselves in the town. They know they're going to get attacked. And sure enough, they got attacked by 10x their number by Jeb Stuart's cavalry. And they essentially fought for their lives over a 12-hour period. By the end of the fight, out of the 285, roughly 60 make it back to their lines. Most are captured, some are killed, many are wounded, but that guidon flag was captured in that battle. Ends up in a museum in North Carolina for 140 some years. And in 2008, the Adjutant General of Rhode Island's highest ranking military officer, General Richard Valenti, gets a phone call. And he's telling me this story, and he said, a guy with a southern accent says, hey, we have one of your flags and we'd like to return it. And General Valenti's like, wow. And they have this conversation, they work through some of the logistics. And at the end of the call, the guy from North Carolina goes, by the way, you have one of our flags and we'd like it back. And that flag that they're referring to is an Confederate artillery guidon that was captured at the Battle of New Bern as a result of a desperate charge made by the 4th Rhode Island under the command of Isaac Peace Rodman, Colonel. It was one of the first major victories for the North. They captured the entire artillery battery of Colonel Latham, and they took the flag. And it's in our museum today. It wasn't there then when this call happened. And I said, General, what'd you say in response to that request? And I always say, maybe he was exaggerating, I don't know, but he said to me, he said to the guy, over my dead body, will you get that flag back? You lost the war, and too many Rhode Islanders died capturing that flag. It's going to stay here. And despite the disagreement, they returned that flag. It was on Good Morning America, apparently. I'm reading about this years later when we didn't have the flag in the museum. And in the article I read, it said that the Varnum Continentals had the flag. And I'm like, what? I run down the hill, the Armory on a Sunday night, and I'm like digging through all our boxes, like, where is this flag? And then I found out later that the National Guard had it, and they basically put it in a cardboard box, put it in a closet, and just sat there. And I'm like, guys, you got to let us display it. So there it is. Another quick cool story I'll tell. So we got on the left to right here, we got a James rifle, forged in Chicopee, Mass. in 1861. We have a model 1883 Colt Gatling gun with its ammunition limber. It's fully operational. And then on the right, this is a newer edition. Doesn't look as impressive, but it's got a cool little story. That's known as the Tenalley Town gun. In 1862, Stonewall Jackson's threatening to attack D.C. D.C.'s always worried about being attacked. Lincoln puts out a call to some governors to raise some emergency troops to serve for 90 days to help protect the city. Rhode Island immediately responds with the 9th and 10th Rhode Island. Company B of the 10th Rhode Island was made up of Providence High School and Brown University students. And their parents would only allow them to go to war if the former governor of Rhode Island, Elisha Dyer, would agree to lead them. And he does. And so these kids go off to war. And one day they go on a patrol in the Maryland countryside, and they get intelligence that at a farm of a well-known Southern sympathizer is Confederate artillery. So the kids go to the farmhouse, they bang on the door, lady of the house opens up, and she's like, what do you want? She's like, we want to see your artillery, your cannons. She's like, there's no cannon here. And right at that moment, they see the husband in the field, and the husband sees them. He starts to run. They get him to stop. And then right at that moment, their little daughter comes walking home from school, and she walks up to the soldiers, and the first words out of her mouth was, "You're not getting our cannon." So they threatened to arrest the family and march them back to their camp. And under that threat, the family's okay, and they open their barn door, and that thing was sitting in there. It's a little 1-inch rifled steel tube, no maker mark on it. The men are disappointed. They're expecting something more like a James rifle. But later, as aging veterans, they became very proud of that gun. And they would pose with it in front of the Providence City Hall and the State House for years at reunions and things. And sadly, it was almost thrown in a dumpster. It ended up in an abandoned state-owned building in downtown Providence. And the contractor, thankfully, called the National Guard and said, "Hey, we got this thing. If you don't take it, we're going to put it in the dumpster." And to the National Guard's credit, they scooped it up, and then they gave it to us. It's actually, it's pictured in their regimental history, which is kind of neat. That whole story I told you is directly from their regimental history. So I'm going to tell you about one of our first and biggest conservation projects that we ever took on. The town clerk of Bristol, let me know if I go too long. The town clerk called me one day and he said, "Hey, we've had these old flags in the old town chambers. They're wrapped around their original flagpole, covered in plastic, duct taped shut, and they've been stacked in this little case for like, we think 40 years, and we don't know what they are. Can you help us figure that out?" So Maria and I went there. This is in the middle of summer. We took them out of the case and we started to take the plastic off. If you know anything about 19th century silk, it's incredibly fragile. 19th century silk in particular, they used a metallic salt of some kind. They added this chemical that made silk have a certain sheen and a feeling, like a weight to it, but it basically caused the silk to turn to dust, given enough time. So we had to stop unfurling it. I made a deal with the town. I went to the town council. They unanimously allowed us to take all 8 flags out of the building, and we took them to the Armory. That's in the red shirt there. That's Andy, our contractor. He can do anything, build anything. We made these ghetto humidification chambers. So we have the flags are, wrapped around their poles underneath the plastic, and we just went to Lowe's and bought some cheap humidifiers, kept filling them with water every day, and we did this for about 3 weeks to soften them up to allow us to actually unfurl them without causing quite as much damage. But you can see how bad some of them were. Now at this point, we think we have Ambrose Burnside's headquarters flag, is what we thought, the 9th Corps flag. We thought this was going to be a national news story. Turned out we ended up unfurling them on camera with PBS, and it turned out that most of the flags were Grand Army of the Republic flags, GAR Post 15, known as the Babbitt Post, for Jacob Babbitt of the 7th Rhode Island, killed in the attack on Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg. However, there were 2 incredible flags in this bunch of 8. This was the one. This is a 33-star flag, hand sewn by the ladies of Bristol for Company G of the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers. This flag was carried at the Battle of First Bull Run. It exhibits some battle damage. There's what we believe to be blood stains. We found an article in the Bristol Phoenix that talks about the presentation of this very flag to the men. It's fluttering there in that picture. Now you look at that and you're like, what in the world are we going to do with that? Right? For a lot of people, they see that and they're like, it's too far gone, just burn the flag. But not so. Look at this. So this is a before and after. 91st Pennsylvania Infantry Regimental National Colors. This flag flew at Little Round Top on July 2nd. But you can see how bad it is on the left and then what it looks like today. This is my, if you're, Union Drummer Boy. Brendan Cinnamon, do you know him at all? No. So it's a relic store that's right off of the town square in Gettysburg. He's a younger guy. It's this guy here on the left. He's one of my best friends. And anyway, this is his shop. You can have this flag for a mere $35,000. So here's one of the flags that Maria did. So this is beautiful Babbitt post number 15 GAR. It was all crumpled up, broken, holes in it. And you can see what it looks like afterwards. Just amazing work. Hundreds of hours to get it to that point. I'm going to speed this up because I want to tell another Civil War story. So the most important flag in this group of 8, though, turned out to be the oldest flag in America that the country basically had forgotten existed. It used to be a very important flag to the town of Bristol. The only way we were able to figure it out is we have the original flagpole finial, and it's engraved here. The gift of Colonel Nathaniel Byfield to the 1st Company of Militia. Another side of that finial says Captain Nathaniel Byfield, 1687. But then it says Bristol for the time being, 1724. With those 3 clues, we were able to figure out exactly what this was, but it's the Colonel's Company flag. It used to be red. All that dye has worn off. This was carried in King William's War and Queen Anne's War. The flag was first purchased and presented to the militia in 1695, which makes this the oldest flag by a significant amount in the Americas. You can see what it looks like before and after. We think we have a blood stain here. We had samples tested by the Smithsonian Institute Science Lab, and it's indicative of human blood. It's got protein and iron content in the sample, but it's not conclusive, so we're going to do more tests. They also scientifically proved through the sample testing that this was indeed a red flag, but it was always plain. There was anything on it. And a plain red silk banner in the 17th century was the Colonel's Company flag, or Company A. This is going to go on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Army too for a period of 2 years. They view it as the beginnings of the American military, in effect. And it was also carried in America's first 4th of July parade. All right. So I actually brought a show and tell thing today. This is, I mentioned that we have a lot of synchronistic things. I'll probably close with this story. So, anybody here familiar with the story of Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery at the Battle of Gettysburg? Anybody heard that story? No? Yes. All right, so Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st to the 3rd, 1863, biggest battle in the war. The 2 armies collide at Gettysburg. About 160,000 guys fight each other over 3 days, just epic in scale, 51,000 plus killed, wounded, or missing. Battery B arrives on the battlefield on July 2nd. And they are led by this guy. His name is T. Fred Brown of Providence, Rhode Island. We have his uniform in our collection, direct from the family. He was very short. He was 5 foot tall, so short that when the war broke out, he tried to enlist in the infantry, and they turned him away because he was too short. I'm sure later in the war they would have taken him. But undeterred, he ends up in the artillery and has very strong leadership skills, and he quickly rises to command Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light. They have 6 12-pound Napoleons, about 120 Rhode Islanders, equal number of horses. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, they arrive on day 2. The main Federal Army is behind the stone wall atop Cemetery Ridge, facing to the west. Battery B gets placed 300 yards in advance of that line, just south of the copse of trees, perpendicular to the main Federal line. And they have very little infantry support. And they have their guns deployed, and they're firing at a Confederate battery near Robert E. Lee's headquarters to the north. Fred is on remember this, a roan-colored horse. This is like a silver-tipped haired horse. He's on his horse, and he's behind his guns, and he's getting nervous. He knows that they're exposed. And he's thinking, we're going to get called to the south to the peach orchard to help General Sickles, who was getting hammered at that point in time by Longstreet. They're waiting for their reinforcements, their infantry support to come up. And he says he looks to the west and he sees a large body of men appear on the horizon. And they all thought it was their support. It wasn't. As you know, coming from the west, that's where the Confederates were. And it turned out to be 1,200 howling Georgians of Wright's brigade. And they begin firing on Battery B. They close the gap, the distance really quickly. Becomes a complete melee. Almost every horse in the battery is shot down. 2 of the guns in Battery B were captured. Fred has the presence of mind to lead a fighting retreat back to the stone wall to safety. And at the stone wall in that position, the wall has like a gap in it of about, I don't know, 30, 40 feet or something like that. If you go to Gettysburg National Military Park today and you stand in that spot, the wall does end still in that area. And the park rangers refer to that area today as Brown's Gate, in honor of Fred for feeding his battery through this hole in the wall, rolling his remaining guns there, saving them from annihilation. Fred is just inside the stone wall. He's on his roan-colored horse, waving a pistol in the air, and he's leaned over and he's yelling at another officer when he's shot in the neck. Bullet enters, nicks his carotid artery, exits the back of his neck. He falls from his horse. He's basically left for dead. He loses consciousness. Reinforcements come up. They beat the Georgians away. One of Battery B members grabs Fred, realizes he still has a pulse. He ends up in a field hospital. 2 days later, after the battle, he would send a telegram to his father. We have that original telegram in the collection, and he's trying to keep his dad from getting upset. And he literally says, "Don't worry, it's just a flesh wound," is what he said. He would be sent home to Rhode Island, he would recover, and he would go back to the battery in October of that same year and fight the rest of the war all the way through to the surrender at Appomattox. This is where the story gets crazy. 30 years after the war, veterans begin returning to the battlefield of Gettysburg to plan the national park. In order for a regiment to have permission to put a monument in a given spot on the field, you had to get 2 other units to agree that yes, you had been in this position. And so Wright's brigade veterans are trying to figure out where they should put their monument. And they remembered that they had attacked a Rhode Island battery. And one of their members, the guy on the left, Simeon Theus of Savannah, Georgia, writes a letter to the Providence Journal newspaper saying, "Hey, can you help us get in touch with these Battery Rhode Island guys? They're not going to forget who we were." The Providence Journal takes that letter and they give it to Fred. And Fred writes Simeon back and he says, "I, sir, had the honor of commanding the battery that day, and you guys shot me." And Simeon writes back and he literally says, "Whoa, I don't want to put words in your head, but can you tell me what you were doing in the moments just before you were shot? Were you on a roan-colored horse waving a pistol in the air? Because I've been telling this story for decades that you were the only Yankee I was sure I had killed." It's like, wow. So he said that a friend of his walked up to him. He said he grabbed me and he pointed at Fred sitting on his horse, and he's like, "Shoot that Yankee off his horse." And he said, "I raised my infield rifle and I squeezed the trigger and I saw you fall and assumed that you had been dead." And Fred writes him back. We have the original letters that Simeon had written to Fred. Fred writes him back and he says in a very self-deprecating way, he's like, "Yeah, I was wearing a very conspicuous white hat." Now in this collection, that's a whole nother long story that I don't have the time to tell, but the collection is in Knoxville, Tennessee at this point with the family descendants. My buddy Brendan in Gettysburg drives to Knoxville for me, picks up this collection and brings it back to his shop in Gettysburg. I go down, this is now almost 2 years ago. I had to do it. It was a windy day. I was nervous. I didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to, but I'm standing in the area of Brown's Gate where Fred was shot, holding the very white hat that he was wearing the moment when shot in the afternoon of July 2nd. Pinned to the hat is a letter that we now have framed in Fred's handwriting saying, "White hat worn by T. Fred Brown, commanding Battery B at Gettysburg when wounded." And at the bottom of the note he says, "A bullet cut away the small piece from the brim." And on the back side of the hat is a bullet hole. And you can even see the lead ring that was left by the bullet. You can see a little bit of blood spray on, excuse me, on the crown of the hat. But I think this has to be the first time this hat has been in this position since July 2nd, 18. I had goosebumps. Also terrified the wind was going to blow it out of my hands. Even better, so we made, some researchers in the Battery B reenactment group made contact with the descendants of Simeon Theus in Georgia. His granddaughter only recently passed away in her late 90s. And this is probably 6 weeks ago now. On a Sunday morning, the great-great-grandson of Simeon Theus drove all the way up from North Carolina. That's him right there. So this is Fred's frock coat, his McDowell-style forage cap, the white hat that he was wearing when shot, that's the letter. Joseph Quayle is his name. So he's the great-great-grandson of Simeon Theus. He's holding a letter that his grandfather had written to Fred. So that was a really cool moment. But with him, he brings us this treasure. Very nicely taken care of. It's all of the original letters that Fred had written to Simeon. They had kept them. We had transcripts before, but now we have the originals. Very generous of the family to do that. And it's also super cool. Simeon, just after shooting Fred, took a canister round on his left inner thigh, and he carried that canister round in his leg for 29 years, and he said it started to cause him a lot of pain, so he had it surgically removed, and he had it made into a watch fob. And he carried this watch fob for the rest of his life. I'm going to pass this around, just carefully hold it. It's a pretty epic relic. So now we're gonna put all this Battery B material together. There's a picture of it. Pretty awesome. We all had goosebumps when this kid was up here. It was just, I don't know, it's like you're making a connection across time somehow. It's hard to put in words. Let me tell this story. I'll close with this story. This is a shorter one. This is related. So the guy in the top left is Alfred G. Gardner. He's one of the cannoneers that served under Fred Brown at Gettysburg. Alfred Gardner's in his mid-40s. When the war breaks out, he debates with himself for 3 months. Do I enlist? Do I stay with my family? He had 5 children. His wife's name is Adelia. And there's letters where he agonizes, it's my duty to serve my country, but I can't leave my family. And eventually he decides to enlist, and he ends up in Battery B. And he would carry this Bible in the pocket of his sack coat virtually every day of the war. When he would run out of paper to write a letter home, he would use the Bible as a diary. So in the margins of the pages, he would write little messages in pencil to his children mostly. Words of advice, words of wisdom, really emotionally charged stuff. At the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd, when Fred is wounded, he would survive that attack. And that night, basically under the trees, the copse of trees, he would write the last message to his children in that Bible. So on July 3rd, as everybody here I'm sure knows, Robert E. Lee decides to attack the Union Center, located right where Battery B's position was. Supposedly the copse of trees, the stand of trees that Alfred's gun was physically anchored on, that was supposedly the attack point, known as Pickett's Charge. 12,000 Confederate infantry sent across that field the afternoon of July 3rd. Preceding the infantry assault, they had about, I think it was 135 guns, something like that, 125, 135 guns spread across a 2-mile front. 1 p.m. on July 3rd, a signal gun goes off from the Washington artillery. All those Confederate guns start firing. It was described as being the loudest event in human history at this point in time. They could hear the gunfire as far away as Harrisburg. The men talked about how the ground literally shook beneath their feet. At this point, Battery B begins to return fire. And Alfred reaches over, as the number 2 man, reaches over the carriage of the cannon. He grabs a cotton bag of gunpowder. And he's about to load the tube when at that moment a Confederate shell from 2 miles away arches over the battlefield and smacks the muzzle of his cannon. The shell explodes. It decapitates William Jones, the number 1 man, just feet away from Alfred. Alfred has his left arm severed just below his shoulder. He gets a gaping wound in his rib cage and he falls on his back. He's bleeding to death. His best friend, his tent mate, was Albert Strait. They had made a pact that if either one of them were ever to be harmed, they would immediately stop what they're doing and come to their aid. True to his word, Albert goes to Alfred, and he said Alfred is laying on his back with his arm outstretched, his one arm outstretched. Albert says he grabs his hand, and he said the first words out of his mouth was, "Please tell my wife I died happy. Please, please make sure she gets my Bible." Albert says they're under fire. He doesn't take the Bible right away. He bids farewell. He turns his back. And he says that he hears Alfred yell out in a loud and clear voice, "Glory be to God. Hallelujah. I am happy. Amen." And he would, seconds later, would bleed out and die. They repulse Pickett's Charge. Big victory for the North. On July 4th, they dig a hole in front of their gun to bury the 2 men. And Albert, at this moment, remembers the Bible, and he instructs one of his men to go retrieve the Bible. So this Bible that we have on display in our museum was in Alfred's pocket as he passed away. When you read the inscriptions in the Bible, you completely understand why he wanted that. Those were his dying words, was to make sure they get the Bible. And the last entry that I've seen with my own eyes, it says, July 2nd, 1863, Gettysburg, in battery, all ready for action. I am well in body and my mind is clear about the future. The thought of heaven has cheered me on this march from Falmouth to Pennsylvania. And then he says, children, exclamation point, always be of good cheer and always do right. This is the wish of your father. And the Bible was sent home to his wife Adelia. And she refers to it as a national treasure, a symbol of the sacrifice that Rhode Island made in the Civil War. This is known today as the Gettysburg gun. It's in the Rhode Island State House today. It is the gun that Alfred was killed at on July 3rd. Actually, 3 men working that gun died from their service on this gun at the Battle of Gettysburg. There's apparent battle damage all over the gun. I just closed the deal with the state of Rhode Island. The Gettysburg gun is coming to the Varnum Armory for a period of 2 years, starting in August. We're going to be able to put all of this Battery B material together for the first time. And I negotiated a deal in Gettysburg to get a piece of the original piece of the copse of tree that this gun was basically right up against. So it's a trunk about this big. In the Foundation Museum lobby, they have a large section of the copse of trees, and it's filled with shot and shell. It really gives you a sense of how ferocious it was. To close that story, we know from letters that Alfred would write home to his wife that he would often pick wildflowers along the march and at battlefields, rare flowers, and he would pick them and he would fold them in the letters that he would send home to his wife Adelia. We just knew that from existing letters. Never seen the flowers. I share this stuff on social media all the time. A year ago, in April, I get a message, a private message from an active duty Army officer. He says, I've got something that I think you're going to want. It's not the best picture of it, but it's a scrapbook. Open the cover. I met this guy in Gettysburg. It says Adelia Gardner. And it's all the flowers that he had sent home. And he, apparently he would carefully note like the date and the location of where he picked all the flowers, and she would carefully transcribe that in here. And I have this page that I have it open to. It says June 22nd, 1863, Falmouth, Virginia, and then she writes the last, ... Yeah. Amazing. I mean, what are the odds that this would survive, right? A, and then B, that it would end up in our hands. That just blows my mind. It's like it's meant to be. I've probably talked long enough. Any questions?
The flags that you spoke about, where are they now?
So, that's a good question. That's another, it's one of our biggest areas of focus. So, the state regimental battle flags belong to the state. They had been on display in the State House. If you look at the picture of the Gettysburg gun behind it, that's a facsimile, but they used to be displayed just as you see it. They left them on their flagpoles, no climate control, direct sunlight for over a century, and they would literally, you look on the bottom of the case and you would see pieces of silk, just flags just melting away. They have 83 flags in the collection. They span from Revolutionary War through World War I, World War II. All of the Civil War regimental flags are in that bunch. They had the presence of mind back in 2016 to remove the flags. They had a conservator in New York stabilize the flags. They're in an art storage facility in, I think it's Canton, Massachusetts, somewhere in that area. Anyway, I've been socializing a proposal to save those battle flags, starting with the 2 Revolutionary War flags that are in the collection, the 2 most valuable, the 2 rarest flags. These 2 flags were carried by the combined Rhode Island Regiment of 1781. They were carried at the Yorktown campaign. So the proposal is the United States Army and the Varnum Armory Museum are going to conserve the 2 flags together. They'll do one, we'll do the other. The Army will pay for one, that's like $50,000, and then the other flag, we're going to do it at a cost of $30,000. And I said, we'll do it at our expense, we'll raise the money. So we're going to do this great work at no expense to the Rhode Island taxpayer is kind of our selling point. And we've been socializing it with the governor, with the Secretary of State's office, there's a million stakeholders. It's frustrating how many there are. We have tentative approval to do this. The problem is we have to change the law. The law is written such that they're not allowed to be displayed anywhere outside of the State House. So we have to make an amendment to the law, which we're confident we can do. It's just going to take time. So that's like one of our biggest conservation projects right now, is to do that. Yes, sir.
Can I? Sorry, I got over. I just want to have you ask a question. How was your museum funded? Do you get grants?
We get grants. So our operating expenses are paid through ongoing rentals. So we rent part of the Armory, the back of the Armory. We have this big garage, fenced work area. We have a little office. We rent that to the school department of East Greenwich. That's annuity income every month. We also own the James Mitchell Varnum estate a few blocks away from the Armory. We operate that as a museum today. There's 2 rental properties associated with that gives us some income. And then we rent the drill hall for public events. We're very selective today about who we allow to do that. We have a lot of work to do. So we have about $150,000 in the bank today. For large projects, we write grants. So to do anything big on the building, we just restored the windows over the last few years. We go to Champlin Foundation in Rhode Island primarily. 1772 Foundation, the Rhode Island Foundation. We have a small endowment today with the Rhode Island Foundation. It's my belief, and this isn't widely known yet, we're working on this internally, but we have too much stuff for a little small volunteer group to manage with the amount of money that we have. So I want to actually have a different preservation model for the house, to put a historic easement on the property to preserve its historic nature, but sell it. And then with the money from the sale of the Varnum house, we would basically be able to $1.5 million endowment, and then just on the guaranteed 4.5% that we're guaranteed every year on that, that would more than cover all of our operating expenses. Insurance is our biggest cost, $22,000 a year. That's property liability, D&O, collections insurance. Then our number 2 biggest bill is energy. That's $15,000 a year. Yeah, so we're working through these big issues now. We're really trying to change the organization over the last 10 years from being frankly, a men's social club to being, treating it like a professional museum. Outsiders, it's very hard to get money grants these days. And if you're not doing a lot to engage with the community and show an impact on kids in the state, for example, they're not interested in giving you any money. So we have to, with the little resources we have, we're trying to do more to impact the community. We're trying to bring more school groups in, and we promote our conservation work as a service to the state. We're basically saving the state's history, the military history anyway, that no one else is doing. Rhode Island is one of the only states in the country with no state history museum, which is bizarre given the amount of unique history that we do have. So I feel like we're doing a service to the state. I've never really gone to the state for money. That's another avenue, legislative grants and things like that. But,
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
I'll ask the final question then. What led you to really get involved with this? What was the kind of genesis of your involvement with the Varnum Continental Museum?
I've always had a fascination for military history since I was a little kid. I had a grandfather who was a World War II veteran, great uncles that were World War II vets, so I think that got me into it. I always had a special interest in the Civil War, and living in Rhode Island, I worked for a company called Schneider Electric. It's a huge company, and some of our employees were at the Varnum Armory as members, and they're like, you gotta come in here, you gotta come in and help us out, and one thing led to another. Yeah. So it's just a passion.
Well, thank you, Patrick. This was certainly a very engaging. Make sure that gets back to you.
Yes, thank you.
First things first, artifacts and safe care. We did have a book raffle this evening, if you wouldn't mind. Mm-hmm. Patrick, if you want to pull a number for us. Larry, if you win, I swear.
Need my readers. 386-5473. 5473, the last 4 digits. Somebody's got it. 386.
You do not, do you?
No?
Anybody? Going once?
5473.
Going twice. Okay.
Somebody lost out. All right. 386-5474.
I got it. 5474.
You got it.
All right.
We have a winner. You're welcome.
We'll get to the book. It's at the rear. So just real quick before we all part ways today, on Memorial Day, the museum is going to be open from 12 to 4.
From 4, yes. Coffee,
liqueur machine, stuff like that. Some small pastries, and the museum will be.
So certainly if you're around, there's support for our friends next door at the Military Museum. Perhaps no more fitting way to spend Memorial Day than in a museum that talks about military history. And remember, this Saturday, May 27th, at Rural Cemetery, we'll be hosting our annual Memorial Day service. With that, thank you everyone for coming out. There's still some lovely pumpkin raisin bread in the back there, delicious, I can say so myself, and some coffee, so help yourselves. And we will see you all on Saturday. Have a good night, everybody.